I'm obviously here with Bob Rubin and Melissa Carney. I'm going to introduce them in a second. We're going to talk for a bit about where our economy is, and then we're going to open it up and try to get a couple questions from you all. So Bob Rubin, of course, is a former Treasury Secretary. He's the original head of the National Economic Council, right? First person to have that job. He's helped run Goldman Sachs. He's helped run Citigroup. And now he is senior counselor at Centerview Partners. Is that right?
Yep.
All right. Melissa Carney is a professor of economics.
Also chair and emeritus at the Council of Foreign Relations.
Sure, at the Council of Foreign Relations. Melissa Carney is a professor of economics at the University of Maryland. She is also the director of the Aspen Economic Strategy Group, which is this fascinating group that is modeled, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, on the Aspen Strategy Group, which is a long-time bipartisan group that has tried to contribute to U.S. foreign policy, and now it's the same sort of idea trying to contribute to U.S. economic policy. Melissa previously ran the Hamilton Project, with which Bob was very involved. So I'm going to try to give you a very, very short introduction to what's going on with the U.S. economy right now, and then give Bob and Melissa an opportunity to disagree and really add to it at more length than I'm going to do. But I think what's tricky about the U.S. economy right now is that there are some really obvious strengths and really obvious weaknesses. The strengths are that this expansion has just hit its 10th anniversary, and since about late 2015 or 2016, it's been picking up in a way that helps ordinary workers. The unemployment rate has fallen quite low. Wages have started rising, including at the bottom. All that is good news. I find it difficult to attribute any of that to either the current or the most recent, the cyclical part of it, the current or the most recent president. It started under Obama. It's gotten a little bit better under Trump. The predictions that Trump would lead to an economic disaster have clearly proven wrong. On the other hand, the predictions that Trump's tax cut would lead to a flowering of business investment have also proven wrong. And the economy's basically continued on the path that it was on under Obama. That's the good news. What I consider to be the bigger bad news is that the bounty of this economic growth is really not flowing to large numbers of Americans. Raises have matched economic growth only for roughly the top 10 or 5% of the income distribution. Raises have exceeded economic growth only for the top 1%. For the vast majority of Americans, pay is increasing more slowly than economic growth. And that's actually sort of the best news. When you look at net worth, it's still, median US net worth has still not returned to its level before the financial crisis. Typical American is poorer than the typical American household was more than a decade ago. We can go through all kinds of metrics like this. The one that I find to be the most depressing, and the one that sort of clinches the case that it's not just the particular economic statistics that you're looking at, are that life expectancy for the average American has declined over the last 3 years, which is not something that should be happening in a healthy economy or a growing economy. So that's my super short introduction. And I guess would like to ask both Bob and Melissa, if there's anything in there that you disagree with, please correct me. But more importantly, kind of take us to a deeper level and give us a sense for how you see what's going on with the US economy.
Well, I think, David, in some measure, I agree with you. In some measure, I think I look at it a little bit differently. We have good economic conditions for the moment, although I think I still have a job in an investment banking firm, and you can get a sense, at least I think, the things may be slowing down. But that's the immediate. And what troubles me, and actually worries me very deeply, David, is that while we have great strengths for the longer term in our economy, and I would rather invest here or do business here in our economy than any other, very much including China, about which I think there's a lot of under-recognized issues. We're only going to realize that potential if we meet hugely consequential economic policy challenges. And if you look back over the last 15 plus years, David, I think we have met virtually none of these. We had a tax cut that was deficit funded. You can have your own view on what you think about that. I wrote that in the Washington Post that it was an op-ed that I thought it was a fiscal tragedy, which means I didn't like it. We had you have the ACA, which I at least think is very good. You all may have a different view. We had the financial reform bill. But basically, if you look at the great preponderance of our economic policy challenges, something that Melissa and I spent a lot of time on with the Hamilton Project, we have not addressed them. And what worries me as we go forward is that unless we do address all kinds of human capital issues, the income inequality that you mentioned, which I think will undermine our economy over time for multiple reasons, infrastructure, basic research, and so much else, our fiscal policies, which I think are leading us at some point, and I know this is a highly controversial issue, but I at least think it's leading us to perdition eventually, and maybe not so eventually. So I think the real problem, David, is we simply have a dysfunctional political system that is doing virtually nothing of what needs to be done. And I think that if we do what needs to be done, and let me say in the context of what needs to be done, I think there are two interdependent objectives, and we're not going to achieve either without the other. We need strong growth, and we need widespread economic well-being and reduced economic inequality. And unless you do both, I don't think you'll get either. And to look at it just from the point of view of the growth perspective, I've been focused on economic growth ever since I was in our administration, I don't think that you will get public and political support for market-based economics, which I think is essential for growth, or for globalization, which also contributes greatly to growth, unless the great predominance of the American people feel they will benefit from these policies. And today, for the very reasons you cited, a goodly portion of our population does not. So the only way we get to where we need to get is to reestablish in some fashion or other a functionality in our political system that is sufficient to meet our challenges. So I think, and this is my last comment on this, I think the fundamental and dispositive question with respect to the future of our economy is not any economic issue. It's whether or not we reestablish sufficiently, not terrifically, but sufficiently effective government, constructive and effective government, to meet our challenges. And as you all know, empirical evidence at the moment is pretty discouraging. Most of the people, David, that you and Melissa and I know are involved in political life one way or another are deeply concerned. I'm also deeply concerned. But I kind of have a more affirmative view, as I am deeply concerned, and there's certainly no guarantees, and we may not do it. But I have a somewhat more affirmative view about the probabilities over time, though it could be a long and messy process, than I think prevails amongst the people we know.
Good. Let's make sure we get back to your optimism. Melissa, how do you think about the strengths and weaknesses in the economy?
I don't disagree with anything either of you have said. I think a lot of what we're talking about, I think of in terms of sort of three specific challenges. The first is income inequality, which we all hear a lot about, and I am increasingly convinced that it really is a problem. I used to be a bit more sanguine about it, saying, well, as long as everyone was doing better, the gaps themselves didn't bother me so much, but that's not the way our economy has worked for the past 40 years. Very different from the way it worked from the 40s to the 70s, when growth really then meant that everyone did a bit better. Now what we've seen since the 1980s is the growth, the prosperity that the nation has enjoyed has gone disproportionately to the top, and increasingly to the very, very, very top, right? So we're talking about the top 1%, the top 0.1%, and too many people are being left behind. It's undermining our functioning as an economy because it is undermining a belief and the reality of what we all thought used to be the case in the US was that there was something approaching equal opportunity, something approaching a meritocracy, something approaching upward mobility and real prospects of upward mobility. But the gaps now are so tremendous that they're being passed on to future generations, right? The kids who are being born in the bottom half, their childhood experiences look nothing like what the kids from the top of the income distribution look like, in a way that they just can't compete. And we're moving to a system where we're going to have really entrenched classes in this country. So that's why I find income inequality at the top of the list of problems. The other thing I worry a lot about is the decline in employment among prime age individuals in this country. So you talked about the recovery. We've had a great recovery. Unemployment rates are really low right now, but it's still the case that men in this country are working at levels far below what they've worked at in recent history.
And what is it? Sorry to interrupt. Is it like something like 12% of prime age men are not working now?
Yeah, but in particular, it's men without a college degree that we've seen the largest declines. So right now, 90% of men with a college degree are working as compared to only 80% of men with a high school degree. It's even lower if you look at high school dropouts. For women, that difference is 83% of women with a college education versus 61% of women with a high school degree. 40 years ago, there was no difference. Men of all education levels worked at about 95%. So we're really seeing everyone but the highest educated Americans, their employment is down. And this is bad at an individual level. It means lower levels of economic security for these people, but it's also bad for our prospects of growth, right? We need more skilled workers. And quickly, the third thing that is interrelated, and you talked about mortality rates, this has gone hand in hand with really sort of social despair among these same groups of people. Right, so the folks who don't have college educations, we're seeing deaths of despair up from drugs and alcohol and suicide. And something that most economists don't want to talk about, but I'll throw it out there because I don't think we could avoid it, is the retreat from two-parent families among essentially everyone but those with college educations in this country. So 85% of kids born to moms with a college education are still raised in two-parent families, and all of the tremendous advantages that family structure yields to kids. And the rate among those with some college or high school degree, so we're not talking about the teen moms, we're not talking about the high school dropouts, the middle group. In the past 20 years, the rate at which kids in those families are living in two-parent families has fallen from 84 to 60%. And that contributes again to these kids having different experiences, the men in those communities not being part of the workforce or family life, and just contributes to this social despair.
Yeah, and I mean, we may get a question about this. I know sometimes there are questions about, yes, but if you slice the economic numbers just this way, things look better. And we can have some of those debates. But to me, when you pile on the stuff that's not economic, right? When you look at the situation with the decline of two-parent families, when you look at the deaths of despair, I mentioned the overall life expectancy numbers, or you look at the survey data. I mean, basically, it hasn't been, Bob, we may need to get you back in government. It hasn't been since Bob's been in government that a majority of Americans have said the country's on the right track. So that's a 20-year period in which the economy has mostly been growing. It's a 20-year period where we've had Republican and Democrat and Republican presidents again, and sort of no matter what happens, most Americans have said the country's not on the right track. And you look at one institution after another, right? I've gone around and given a lot of talks when I was in management at the Times about the state of the media, and people say, how can we restore trust in the media? And part of the answer is we in the media can do a better job. But the fact is, the other things that have lost trust include organized religion, organized labor, large companies, the US Congress, the US presidency. Essentially everything except the US military isn't trusted by most Americans. The biggest decline has been the US healthcare system. And so when you look at all of this data, to me it argues quite strongly that there is no way to slice the economic data that actually make things look good. So I want to get back to your optimism, but it looks like you're going to say something.
I didn't stress optimism. I said I have a more affirmative view than the prevailing view amongst those who are concerned. That's not optimism.
It's relative optimism.
It's relative optimism. I mean, it's probabilities, and if their probabilities are here, mine are here. Okay.
So what do we need to do?
I think the tragedy, David, is this is a very rich country, and I don't think there's any question. Marty Feldstein died recently, and it's a shame. Marty was a wonderful, wonderful man. You know who he was. He was a senior economist and head of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and one of America's. Marty said, he's a very conservative Republican. And Marty said to me a couple of years ago, we were talking about our fiscal situation. And Marty said to me, you know something, you and I, Marty and me, have quite different views of what we should do. But if you and I, since we're both committed to effective government, to principled compromise, and to looking at facts and analysis with intellectual integrity, if we sat down in a room, we could solve this problem in an afternoon. That was a little bit hyperbole on his part, but the point was basically right. We are a very wealthy country, David. We could deal with these issues, but the problem is there has to be a willingness in our political system, which is now, and the willingness I'm about to mention is virtually entirely absent, to engage in principled compromise, because our system cannot work without principled compromise. You cannot move forward except on rare occasions unless you're willing to compromise with people who you disagree with and maybe even view as repugnant. And it can't work unless there's a willingness to ground decisions in facts and analysis, and you approach them with intellectual honesty, not a focus on alternative facts, recognizing that politics will always be involved. So the question is how we accomplish all that. I have a friend who had been the deputy chief of staff to both, no, he was chief of staff to both Gore and Biden. So he's kind of conversant with all this stuff. And he said to me the other day, we really are caught in a vicious cycle, because everything that Melissa said, and David said, is right. People have lost confidence. A goodly portion of our population has lost confidence in our political system because it doesn't perform for them. As a result, instead of supporting the kinds of policies that can get us back where we need to be, they support what I'll call populism, but we can discuss what we think that means. Populism and nationalism. That is to say, proposals that may be terrific in terms of the issues they raise. And I think these things, these kinds of proposals really do raise critical issues, but they're not effective responses to those issues. And what they're not supporting is what they sort of support proposals that can be put on bumper stickers and are politically appealing, as opposed to the complex answers that we need to complex problems. Then the conditions get worse and you're caught in a vicious cycle. And the question is, how do we get out of that? And that then becomes right back to the same question again. How do we reestablish the effectiveness of our system? I want to make one other thing, if I may say so. For those of you who are interested for business or investment or other reasons in the future of our economy, Jason Furman was over at the council a couple of years ago. Well, it was after Obama, the end of Obama. Anyway, Jason was chairman, as you know, of the CA, and then after Jason left, he came over, we had a little dinner with people. And Jason estimated, right, the CBO, as you probably know, projects long-term growth for the United States economy of give or take 1.9%, 2%, whatever it is. Jason estimated that if we really met our challenges, if we did all that we need to do so we can get the advantage of all this technological development and globalization, instead of suffering from the pressures it creates on wages and jobs, we might be able to grow more toward 2.4% or something like that, 2.5%. Conversely, we had a discussion of what happens if we don't meet our challenges. This was not with Jason, it was somebody else. But it was a group of very highly respected economists. And their judgment was, instead of having what I just described, we could have growth fall below 1.5%, increasing inequality, increasing social stress. So the stakes here are enormous, David. The stakes, that is to say, in getting back our political system. So most of you, maybe almost all of you, are involved in one way or another with our political system. You contribute to candidates, you meet candidates, who knows. And I think what I myself do, and I think all of us should do this, is urge them to do two things. Whatever your views may be, you may be conservative, maybe liberal, whatever it is, we want you to commit to effective governance. That is to say, commit to engaging in principled compromise with those you don't agree with, and commit to focusing on facts and analysis with intellectual integrity, even though politics will always be involved. Because that is the key to getting back on track.
Melissa, what do you think we need to do?
So I'll answer at a more granular level.
Because you know more than I have.
No,
So you can do that.
assuming that this vision of policymakers actually working together to affect useful policy happens, the number one thing I think this country needs to do at a massive level is invest more in the human capital of our people, and that means more investment in education. And I know there are people who are getting tired of that prescription and saying, no, we need to break up the big companies, we need to increase worker bargaining, and I don't disagree that there are other things we could do, but if you look at the data on where all the divides are in terms of who is doing well in the economy and who is doing not, there is no denying the fact that the single biggest divide is those with a college degree and without. And so both for reasons of expanding economic security and for our global competitiveness, we need more college graduates. But I'll be specific. So what I think—
Can I interrupt you one second?
Yeah.
But because I know what you think. I ask you, but you're talking about college.
Yet.
Well, I know, knowing you for a long time, I think I know what you think, maybe I don't. But in addition to college graduates, how would you think about people who are not going to go to college or shouldn't go to college?
Okay, good. So yeah, I care about that too. So let me say a couple things. So first, when I say we need more college graduates, what I mean is we need a much larger federal and state investment in the institutions that are serving the majority of college students in this country, and that is public colleges and community colleges. So we have 20 million college students in this country. 15 million of them are at public universities. 6 million of them are at community colleges. That's a subset, okay? Do you know how many are at Harvard? I'm gonna poke a little bit of fun at New York Times right now. 7,000? Right, for all of the—
Even less, probably.
Okay,
Yeah.
For all of the attention that we give to Harvard and the other elite schools, and for all the hand-wringing about how are we gonna get more low-income kids to Harvard or Stanford or Princeton, those are not the engines of social mobility. The public colleges, the community colleges, serving 15 million students, those are the engines of social mobility, and they are wildly under-resourced, okay? Now, I am not saying we need free college. In fact, I think free college would dramatically exacerbate the problem. We already have large numbers of students going to college. Since 1990, we've had a 45% increase in enrollment, a 4% increase in state appropriations. right? So now we have lots of students, they got the message, I need to go to college, but then they get there and they're not served very well by these cash-strapped public and community colleges. And so we need to be putting more money there to increase the experience, the skill attainment, and the graduation rates. So now let's talk about this other sort of, often objection to this idea, which is not everyone needs to go to college or not everyone's going to go to college. So I have two thoughts on that. The first is a lot of that I think reflects what people, a lot of people in rooms like this think about when they think about college. You think about a 4-year liberal arts education, but that's not what it is to most people. And in fact, what most people are getting when they go to these colleges is something that would look more like vocational training. So I was in a room last week where somebody said this, not everyone needs to go to college. We need more vocational training. I said, do you think nursing is a vocation? He said, yes. I said, well, you need a 4-year college degree to be a nurse, okay? And a lot of people who go to those 4-year college nursing programs start at a community college. So when I say people need to go to college, a lot of that is vocational. But to your point, we still have a quarter of people not even completing high school. And for them, they need alternative pathways, and we can think about apprenticeships and other sort of career and technical education type programs.
I mean, one way I think about that is a college degree is still really valuable.
Very
I mean, despite the profiles you may have read in my publication and others about someone who has debt who's working as a barista, they are the exceptions. A college degree is extremely valuable. And the next time you hear someone say not everyone needs a 4-year college degree, ask them whether they think their kids need a 4-year college degree. Because 4-year college degrees, you can disagree, but I still think we should be, I still think when people are making decisions for their own kids, they still think it's a good idea, and they sort of, when they think about the other stuff, they tend to be thinking of some sort of other.
Well, David, I had this debate recently with a Democratic governor, who I like enormously, as a matter of fact, I have great respect for. But the fact is that not everybody wants to go to college, not everybody's equipped to go to college. Yep. There are a lot of jobs that are massively important in our society that do not require, now you have the point about the nurse, right, that do not require college education. So yes, do I want my kids to go to college? Yes. But I can easily understand if somebody had chosen not to. And I think that if we think of our society as a whole, I think we have to think more broadly about education.
I agree. I'd just like to see us producing more college graduates. I mean, there was a time where we had a debate in this society a century ago, do we need more high school graduates? Mm-hmm. Right? And I'm really glad the people who were saying everyone should go to high school won that debate. And I think that if you sort of look at the sweep of history, it is reasonable to think that the baseline level of education in 2020 is greater than the baseline level of education
I agree with that.
In 1920.
Can I add one thing to that, which is of all the very important jobs that don't require a college degree, and that's true. So we know that the nature of work being done by non-college educated workers has changed a bit in this country. So what we know from the data on jobs is that there's been a polarization in job creation, so that there are increasing numbers of jobs that pay very high wages and demand very high skills. And then there's been an increase in jobs that pay low wages, and the middle has sort of hollowed out. And what you've seen is the workers who had college degrees and were getting middle wages in previous generations, now they've mostly moved up. And the middle skilled folks who were getting middle wages without a college degree, they've mostly moved down. So that's a sort of move away from office secretarial work or blue collar jobs in manufacturing. Those folks have now shifted into low paying service jobs, labor jobs. Okay, so agreed, those people need those jobs and we need those jobs to function. And so we do need also, as a policy measure, I think, much more expansive wage supports, right? So I would expand the earned income tax credit for sure. And I would do things, again, in a functioning government, right? Much more support for child care and rental assistance, low income housing assistance for low wage workers.
Now, to do all of this, to do any of what we need to do, we need to have fiscal resources. Nobody wants to discuss this in the present presidential primaries. Debt to GDP in this country, the federal debt to GDP, the public held debt of the federal government, which is the way to measure this, not the total debt in the Social Security Trust, is 78%. The CBO projects it going to 103% in 10 years under what they call current policy. And I think if you study this and know enough about it, you'd probably think that the odds are higher rather than lower. And at some point, and I think well before we get to that point, let me put it differently. I think there are enormous risks in that. The risks haven't, for the most part, materialized, or they have in terms of our resilience and our reduced ability to engage in public investment. And I think the risk will continue. The probability of the risk materializing in terms of interest rates, business confidence, our currency, will increase as time goes on. and yet nobody in the political environment really wants to face this in a realistic fashion.
So let me ask you a skeptical question about that, which is, in the current presidential campaign, we've got Elizabeth Warren calling for a wealth tax that would raise an enormous amount of revenue. We've got Bernie Sanders calling for a very large increase in the estate tax, would also raise revenue. I had Pete Buttigieg on the podcast I co-host. He talked about a top marginal tax rate. He liked the idea of 49.99999%. So I guess I understand that you may not like them. You may have other criticisms of them. But I do hear people in this race. I do hear it's not what we traditionally think of as fiscal conservatism, but they want to raise a lot of tax revenue.
Look, tax revenue as a percent of GDP right now, David, as you well know, 16.5%. In full employment economies in the past, they've been about 18.5%, 19%. When we left office, they were a little over 20%, and we had an excellent economy. We need to find revenue. The question is, where do you find it? And I think one of the tests of whether the business community, because I know you have a view on what I'm about to say, the business community in America really is focusing on urging government to be effective and really is focused on the need to reduce inequality and eliminate wage, have healthy increases in wages, without which I don't think we will have the policies they need for growth, is will they support increases in taxes, including the taxes that affect them. Now, let's go to the taxes you mentioned. David, most people who have analyzed Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax, and I've talked to a lot of people who've done this, and who are not biased either ideologically or politically, they're just people who do this for a living. It's how they spend their lives. Think there's a very substantial in excess of 50% probability it will be declared unconstitutional because of the direct tax requirements of the Constitution. Okay. If you think that's true, and if you think it's only be one bite at the apple, you're not going to have a long period of time, most likely, I mean, anything could happen, most likely, where it's politically possible to get tax increases because they're so unpopular. I think it is exceedingly unwise to spend it on something, the probability, which is more likely than not to be declared unconstitutional, particularly with the Supreme Court. Secondly, it is very hard to figure out how a wealth tax is going to work when so many assets are illiquid and also when markets go up and down, et cetera. I think Pete Buttigieg, yeah, I've been with Mayor Pete too. I think his 50% bracket may be the right one. I don't say that's wrong. It may very well be the right one. For those of you interested in this subject, there was a two-part op-ed in the Boston Globe about a month or two or three ago, I don't remember, by Larry Summers and Natasha, I can't remember their last name, very capable woman at Pennsylvania. And what they said was that if we, in some intelligent cost-benefit manner, reform the deductions and credits so that we reduce them down to the point where we no longer have them except to the extent that we think they're really worthwhile in terms of their economic benefit. And if we raise the corporate tax rate to at least 25%, a rate that most CEOs would have died for before this tax bill, we eliminate stepped-up bases at death, we decide what we want to do about the estate tax itself, and we do a few other things. I don't remember the exact number, but they had about 2.7 trillion over 10 or 2.5 trillion over 10, some number like that. It's a large number, David. You can get a lot of money in ways that would be very constructive.
Their number is higher than what most estimates say Warren could collect with her wealth tax.
Their number is higher. It is higher than absolutely correct, Melissa. Now, every effort to raise taxes has all kinds of opposition. But at some point, our society is simply going to have to face the reality that we do not have enough tax revenues to do all the kinds of things that Melissa was talking about. Now, the alternative is to say, we're only going to cut spending, we're not going to worry about taxes, but if we do that, we're also not going to engage in any of the programs. We won't be able to fund the programs that we need to get ourselves back on track, both in terms of growth and widespread economic well-being and a reduction in inequality. And it'll be interesting to see how the business community reacts to the need to get government to function effectively. You can't, if you believe in a market-based economy, then you have to support strong government and effective government, and you have to support reducing inequality and widespread economic well-being, or you're not going to have your market-based economy sooner or later.
You mentioned my view on this. So I've been reading some history lately. I've been reading some history from the 1940s, a lot of Fortune magazine. And boy, was Fortune magazine a beautiful magazine in the 1940s. I mean, just reading through it at the Library of Congress is a pleasant experience, just aesthetically. But it's remarkable to see the views of the business community in those years, because there was a real fear born of the Great Depression, born of the rise of authoritarianism in Germany and the what seemed like, and actually at the time was, the strength of the Soviet Union and the appeal of communism. There was a real sense that we need to make sure that American capitalism works better for workers. And we need to make sure that we come to some kind of peace with labor unions and that we have rising wages. And we are in the right place to be talking about this because the Aspen Institute from Walter Pepke came from that sense that American business has a leadership role, has a patriotic role. It is not simply about lobbying for tax changes that get our taxes as low as possible and our profits, that we basically have to be passionate advocates for capitalism that works for the large numbers of people. And what I worry a little bit about is what got us there as a society was the combination of war and depression. And what I don't see, to be honest, is how do we get back to an America where ordinary people think institutions are functioning, including my own institution, but it's not the most important one, and where businesses see that they have a stake in something larger than their own tax bill. How does that happen?
Yeah, but I'd like to deconstruct that comment.
Okay.
Can I say one thing before that? I know pretty much all of the Democrats who are running this time. And I think we have a lot of good candidates. We'll see what happens. But when you watch what the Democrats are talking about, they're talking about widespread economic well-being. They're talking about reducing inequality. But I think there's far too little talk about growth. Because without growth, you're not going to have the fiscal resources to do all the rest. And that's what President Clinton used to say. President Clinton used to say, you need to have both. If you have growth, then you'll have tight labor markets. Tight labor markets will have higher wages, and you'll have the fiscal resources to do all the stuff that Melissa correctly, and you correctly have said, needs to be done. And there's very little talk about growth right now, unfortunately, at least, yeah, there's very little growth coming from those who are very focused on what I think desperately needs to be focused on, the other two objectives, widespread inequality. Let me deconstruct something, though, that you said, David. You talked about business. I think there are two different ways to look at this. One is so-called social responsibility. I think that is a different question than the one I was trying to raise. And that, I think, is a very complex question on which one can have, at least I have, mixed views. What I was saying is I think what business needs to do is say, if I want my market-based economy, I also have to have a strong and effective government. And my strong and effective government has to promote not only growth, but it has to promote widespread economic well-being and reduced inequality, and that is going to take more taxes, and those more taxes are going to fall in some fair measure on, well, in very large measure probably, on corporate America and on affluent individuals.
Melissa, what do you see government doing that it could do less of? So one way is to get resource for these things we've talked about, and we haven't even talked about climate change, which I think is actually the number one threat. One of the ways is to raise taxes. Another way is to have government do less of something so it can do more of others. What are some things that you see government at the federal, state, or local level doing now that it could do less of?
So I think there's been a lot of attention in recent years in a positive way on regulations, and people are starting to look under the hood more at the types of regulations. Regulations that hamper small business development and business growth, and also working, right? Occupational licensing is finally sort of out there as a top policy priority, which I think is a really good thing. For those who don't know what I'm referring to, it used to be 30 years ago, 5% of the workforce needed a license, like actual license from their state or local government to hold their occupation, and that is now exceeding 30%, right? Far beyond doctors and dentists and people like that. So I think examining those regulations and rolling some of them back would be good for both, labor market outcomes and business outcomes. The other thing that comes to mind, which I really shouldn't say the government should do less of, so take this with a grain of salt, but I teach public finance. Look at the federal budget. Do you know what I'm going to say? I'm going to get myself in all sorts of trouble. And I show the students, we spend a lot of money taking care of the elderly, and less than 1% of the federal budget goes to kids. Yeah. So, and our debt to GDP ratio is on a projection to continue growing in a way that's almost entirely about giving money to the elderly, Social Security, Medicare. I'm not saying that those aren't important programs, but what I'm saying is we have very little money left to make the investments we need to make in kids, in education, in infrastructure, in basic science, the things that are going to lead to growth and make us and keep us a competitive global economy.
Gene Sturley says we have a budget for a declining nation, which is a version of that.
Gene
point.
says that?
Yeah.
Well, okay. Okay, I didn't, okay. Well, we don't have to be a declining nation. We can be an ascending nation if we get our act together. There are two more places you could save a lot of money, David. We spend roughly 18% of GDP on healthcare. The average developed country is about 10%. We have all of you know this, we have a terribly dysfunctional healthcare system. And you can debate what it should be, but in a serious country with a serious government, we would be sitting down with the right kind of people, have all kinds of different views, and we would, maybe experimentally in different states, one thing or another, we would be figuring out how to get that percentage down. And if that percentage comes down, then our Medicare and Medicaid expenses go down without changing benefits at all. And the second thing we could do, which I tried to do when I was Treasury Secretary, and I got clobbered for doing it, I said we shouldn't, I don't want to, I'm not saying, this is what I said when I was there. I'm not saying anything about our national security objectives. Every objective, if you want to, should remain intact. But nobody ever reviews the defense establishment as a McKinsey would review a company to see how efficiently are we achieving those objectives, and could we achieve those objectives more efficiently? And I raised that in the Roosevelt Room of the White House with everybody sitting around, not the president, but the Deputy Secretary of Defense and all kinds of other people. And the Deputy Secretary of Defense, a wonderful guy, looked at me and he said, if you try to do that, we will send all the uniformed people up to the hill and you will get absolutely destroyed. So we would suggest you withdraw that idea. I actually didn't withdraw it. And I did get destroyed. I'm here, so I wasn't totally destroyed. They didn't put the CIA after me or something. But
the idea got destroyed.
Yeah, they got destroyed.
Last question for me. So there's a whole wing of the Democratic Party, Bob, that's associated with your name, right? I'm sure I've been accused of being sympathetic to it. The Rubin wing of the Democratic Party.
And what, pray tell, is that?
And so I think people think of it as centrist Democrats, market-friendly Democrats. I also think that the idea you mentioned from Larry Summers and others on raising taxes is a version of this, which is there are ideas that when you kind of analyze them technically look very good. So I would actually put a carbon tax in this category. I would put much of the ACA in this category, right? Trying to create a expand market-based healthcare. And a lot of these things have proven politically problematic, I would say, for a couple reasons. One, they are designed in part to win. They're designed as compromises to bring Republicans to the table. They're market-friendly ideas. Healthcare famously took an idea Mitt Romney has tried. They're conservative economists who like carbon taxes. But the fact is the actual Republican Party, as opposed to Marty Feldstein, doesn't have any interest in any of these. And so you don't get any votes from the Republican Party for climate things. You got none for the ACA. I don't think you'd get Republican votes for the Larry Summers package of tax increases. The other problem with these ideas is, to a lot of Americans, they don't necessarily make sense. They sound complicated, they sound difficult, and Americans tend to like simple ideas. And so people prefer the idea of expanding Medicare over private exchanges where you will be able to buy healthcare with subsidies depending on your income. And so I guess what I would ask you is, I've reflected a little bit on this, and I've changed my mind a little bit on this, and I would guess you have not, which doesn't make me right. But in fact, if you have the view,
that's correct.
But how do you think about that? That a lot of these ideas are technical ideas that are designed in part to win Republican support. They don't, and then they also don't tend to win over Americans. And so might it be better just to raise the top marginal tax rate to 50% and triple the estate tax rather than do this whole package of things?
Well, the estate tax is about 45% now, so if it tripled, it would be 135%. I'm not quite, it's good you're a journalist, not, okay, but.
Triple the revenue it raises.
Oh, triple the revenue rate, that's different. David, your chances of doing that, with all due respect, are in the neighborhood of zero.
Okay.
So I think the problem you said is exactly right. Well, I think it's right and it's wrong. First place, my views aren't exactly what you just said they are, but that's just being a journalist. And a carbon tax, which is absolutely the right way to get at climate change, is not realistic now. But the alternative that we have, but fundamentally, I think what I've set out is probably, at least I can tell, substantively the only way that's going to get us where we need to go. As you correctly say, the Republicans, as they're currently operating in the Senate with Mitch McConnell, have been unwilling to engage in any principal compromise in anything. But that would be true to what we said. And yet you've got to find some way to work with those who control the other party, since the probabilities are who knows what will happen, but the chances are they will continue to control the Senate. And some of the things like a wealth tax couldn't pass in the Democratic Senate, I don't believe. So I think the answer to, so now to get back to what I think the answer to that is, I do think one needs to be extremely realistic politically, but I also think you have to have things that are going to be effective substantively. So when people say Medicare for all, I don't know how many of you all spend time studying that, but first place, it has no specifics in it, so you don't know what it means.
Right, it means 6 different things.
And to all kinds of different people. Secondly, the politics of that, where you have 180 million people roughly who have their health care through their corporate system, which for the most part they like, not totally at all, and you're telling them, we're going to take it away, the government's going to decide what you get, we will greatly increase taxes because we have to, and we're not going to get away, and this was a really good point made in the Washington Post, you're not getting away from the fact that somebody's going to have to decide who gets health care and who doesn't. It's not as if we're doing away with that.
Right.
So I think the politics of that are probably terrible. I think there are all kinds of things we should do. We're kind of running out of time, but so I don't know anything about part of Democratic. If there's anything identified with me, and I don't think there is, it would be to have serious as a purpose about exactly what President Clinton stood for. Serious as a purpose about policy, intellectual integrity with respect to facts and analysis. Figure out what you think is the best way to go forward. Try to, as President Clinton once said to me, once you do all the good policy thinking, it doesn't matter unless the politics work, so then figure out the politics and go forward. And so I think if we go on a sort of a bumper sticker populist direction, firstly, I don't think it'll happen politically. And secondly, if it did happen, it's not going to work. But I think the world has changed a lot, and I think we all have to change our views on policy and so forth. But certain fundamentals remain the same. For example, we need to have a sound fiscal regime. I think our best hope, David, is that political leaders emerge, as they have in the past in this country, and that support for constructive government, including principled compromise, begins to work in some places, and then other politicians recalibrate their politics, and eventually you get a virtuous cycle, not a vicious cycle.
Melissa, any last words before we open it up?
I was like, we're done already? I would just add that, this is why I'm not a political strategist, and as an economist, though, I mean, the sort of the populist rhetoric of this campaign that calls for these bumper sticker ideas, I get why they're so appealing, right? Universal basic income, Medicare for all, free college. Every one of them, when you study it, is a terrible idea, right? And so I get that incremental changes, expansions of existing safety net programs, right? Closing loopholes in the tax code. These are not as sexy, and you can't just pound them out on a podium, but we have a lot of combined expertise across both parties. I mean, Bob said this, people could come together and make a real difference with things that take more than 3 words to describe.
One quick, one sentence,
Yep.
Not even a semicolon. But these populist ideas do have one great merit, I think. They're raising issues that need to be addressed.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is a great virtue of them.
Okay, where are the microphones? Let's come right here.
Hi, my name is Ernest Esparza. I make
Mark, you're leaving. We don't find it interesting enough to stay?
I am a Aspen KIP fellow. Just first, I want to say yes to the investment into education. Because of the investment that was made into KIP, which is a charter school, I was able to, at 26, I make more money now than both my parents combined. And that's all because of the education that was provided to me. So so I have this love of learning, and I'm trying to understand more of our economics. And I know it's unprecedented what having our president trying to manipulate interest rates. And I'm interested in your thoughts on, do you believe Trump is, at times, tweets about tariffs and just really focuses on tariffs to put pressure on the Fed to lower rates? And yeah, just your thoughts on rates, and should we stay stagnant? Should we go down? Should we go up? What do you think?
Let me give you a one-sentence answer. For 8 years, we never commented on the Fed. And the reason we didn't was that the political independence of the Fed seemed to us imperative, because if you start having Fed decisions made for political reasons, it can lead us to terrible places. And secondly, the credibility of our markets has benefited tremendously from the independence of the Fed. But I think when you have a leader who understands nothing about anything, it tends to unfortunately influence a little bit how these things get dealt with. I shouldn't have said that comment. I take back.
Thanks. So this idea of carbon tax, I love taxing things that we don't want, and taxing bad behavior, maybe not taxing income because it's good and we want it. Sort of like a loaded MMT question. Why can't we just tax things that we don't want? And if we're credible as a government and people believe we're making good investments, spend the money, borrow the money for positive ROI investments.
Why don't we should briefly define MMT, but I'm not going to try to do it.
Can I just
I
say,
can give you a 40-minute answer to that, but I don't think we have 40 minutes. I think, read the op-ed that Larry Summers wrote on modern monetary theory, in which he called it disaster. That was his word. I found it quite persuasive.
I mean, it's the theory that we don't need to worry about the deficit.
Yes, we don't worry about deficits.
but there was another part of your question, which is why can't we essentially just rely on these Pigouvian taxes or tax the things we don't like as opposed to income, which is good? And the short answer there is because you can accomplish, like, a carbon tax is really good because then you discourage this behavior that we don't want and it's good for climate, but you can't accomplish what you need to in terms of redistribution with just those Pigouvian taxes. You need a progressive income tax to adjust for some of that.
That is the problem with the carbon tax. Sir.
Thank you, Stan Kritzik. The House of Representatives is gerrymandered. You have the left way off the left and the right way off on the left, right, and they never agree with anything. And with the Democrats in control of the House, the Republicans in control of the Senate, nothing is getting done. You have the Iowa caucus system, which is so friggin' crazy, I can't believe it. We need the public to demand proper representation, and we need the political parties to compromise on things to get things done, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think you've got it. I think you've got it right. Yeah, I agree.
So far, I've called only on male questioners. Is that help me out here?
I'm not going to comment on that.
One of my concerns is that there's more oversight in our legislative bodies than legislation. Care to comment on that?
So you're thinking of the fact that the House is spending all the time investigating Trump specifically now?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and everything else that they can. I mean, and they're not legislating. Well, that's not true because they have passed 600 bills and nobody really knows about that because the press doesn't do its job of informing us that our institutions are working because they're too busy reporting on the oversight.
Yeah.
So help,
Yeah.
David, that's your question.
No, that's fair. Look, I do think we should do more job writing about policy and the things that they're passing. I try to write a fair amount about it. I mean, there's H.R. 1, which is this bill to expand voting rights, which gets to each of your last two questions, right? Which is a bill that's designed to make it easier for people to vote. It's a bill to address some of the corruption in politics. It's also a bill that has absolutely no chance of getting through a Republican-controlled Senate. So it's a little bit hard to think about how to write about it if it has no chance of happening. I guess what I would encourage all of you to do is, those of us who are in the media know when we write about scandal or we write about conflict, more people are going to read it than when we write about policy. Many of us still write lots about policy anyway, and we say, I don't care if fewer people are going to read this article because I think it's more important. But one of the things that we can ask of the public is spend more time reading about policy than reading about investigation and scandal, which will then create the incentives for us to continue writing about policy, which many of us would actually really like to do. There was one in the back.
Hi, I'm Lisa Gill. I'm a reporter with Consumer Reports, and this is a terrific session. Thank you very much. One of my real concerns is the American debt load in terms of personal finance, and I'm hoping maybe you could say a little bit about sort of the resiliency issue of the American household to withstand small, whether it's a flat tire or other sort of small issues, but the debt load is pretty substantial, thinking about student loans and mortgages, even credit card debt. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, and this gets back to something that the panel started with, which is just most households have close to zero wealth, and building up wealth is a hard thing to do, especially with these folks having, low incomes now, or low wages. There are some sort of really bold proposals out there, like baby bonds. Let's give every American $50,000 that they're entitled to at their 18th birthday. I'm not ready to endorse that type of a proposal, but to an earlier point, I think it's great that we're having this conversation. And the point is well taken and entirely right, that too many households are sort of living just one negative shock away from a brush with poverty.
And the combined net worth of the bottom 50% of Americans, depending which survey you read, is either slightly positive or slightly negative, but it's essentially zero. And to me, the baby bonds proposal, I haven't read all the analysis of it, but I put it in a different category from universal basic income, which I don't like at all. I mean, the idea of essentially saying we're going to have every child in this country automatically come with some wealth, to me is a much better idea than the idea of we're going to pay you in perpetuity not to work.
I agree with that.
How are you going to pay for it, David?
So you're going to raise taxes.
Yeah, but we're raising, no, I agree there. Can I go one sentence?
Yeah, please, you get the last word.
One of America's best known this is a slight ray of hope in what's not been a totally uplifting conversation. Did my thing fall off?
No, you're good.
One of America's best known pollsters, and I at least think perhaps the one I would most highly, well, there are a number I think are really good, and he's certainly one of them. And I'm not going to say his name because that would be unfair, but he said to me the other day, we were talking about this, and he said, it's interesting. He said, the noise is on the left and the right. You've written about this, actually. The noise is on the left and the right. But he said, I have a feeling, even though I can't prove it yet, that a very large portion of the country actually wants this government to work. They're willing to engage in compromise to make it happen. And maybe, if that's so, that will start to manifest itself in such a way that the people who are running for office, I'm not suggesting people who run for office are going to be saints, because they're not, but the people running for office will begin to recalibrate their politics at some point, and that over time could get us back to where we need to be. And I don't mean it, well, I guess I'm being critical in some ways. When President Obama was elected, Mitch McConnell said, my objective is to make sure he doesn't get reelected. What he could have said is, my objective is to work with the president to get everything done that we need to get done, but I'm also going to do everything I can to elect a Republican. But it's that total rejection of effective government that has been so horrendously destructive to our country. But if my friend, who he really is somebody David Melissa know well, is right, then maybe at some point that can begin to shape our politics.
Yeah. And look, if you look at the polls of Democrats, there is a very large base of Democratic primary voters who are centrist, which is exactly what he's saying. So on that note, Bob, thank you. Melissa, thank you. Thank you all for joining us.